There's a strange sentence buried inside the ancient Book of Enoch that becomes more disturbing the longer you look at it. It describes beings that have no ordinary bodies, consume no ordinary food, yet somehow remain hungry. They do not simply disappear after the flood. They continue to afflict human beings. They attack, oppress, destroy, and cause trouble on the earth. And according to the text, their hunger is not temporary. But here is where the story becomes even more interesting. The Book of Enoch never actually says these beings eat fear in the way modern internet claims often suggest. It never describes an electromagnetic vampire feeding on cortisol, adrenaline, or some invisible human energy field. Those ideas are modern interpretations. What the ancient text actually says is stranger in a different way. It says that the spirits of the giants take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst. And that raises a question the ancient author clearly wanted his audience to ask. If these beings cannot eat physical food, why are they still hungry? The answer takes us into one of the most unusual explanations of evil preserved from the world of ancient Judaism, a story involving rebellious heavenly beings, human women, enormous offspring, the flood of Noah, and spirits that remain behind after the bodies of those offspring are destroyed. And when the story is followed carefully, something becomes clear. The Book of Enoch is not really describing monsters that simply want to frighten humanity. It is describing a form of evil that is fundamentally connected to human weakness, human behavior, and human vulnerability. That distinction matters, because it explains why later readers could interpret these spirits in radically different ways. Some saw them as demons, some saw them as a way of explaining the origin of evil spirits. And modern storytellers have transformed them into something else entirely, entities that literally feed on human fear. That last interpretation is compelling. But is it actually what Enoch says? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning. The Book of Enoch is not one single book written at one moment by one identifiable author. Modern scholars understand for Enoch as a collection of several ancient Jewish writings that were composed at different times and later brought together under the name of Enoch, the mysterious patriarch who appears briefly in Genesis. Genesis itself tells us very little about him. Enoch appears in the genealogy from Adam to Noah, and then comes one of the Bible's most enigmatic statements. Instead of describing his death in the normal way, Genesis says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him. That tiny passage created an enormous literary tradition. Later, Jewish writers imagine Enoch traveling through the heavens, witnessing the structure of the cosmos, learning secrets from angels, seeing the fate of the wicked, and receiving revelations about the future. The collection that eventually became known as First Enoch contains several of these traditions, and one of its oldest and most influential sections is the Book of the Watchers. This is where the story of the beings connected with human fear begins. The Watchers are heavenly beings who descend to earth. In the story, a group of them becomes determined to take human women as wives. They make an agreement among themselves, descend together, and establish a forbidden relationship with humanity. The result is the birth of the giants. The text calls these offspring the Nephilim, connecting the story to the mysterious beings mentioned briefly in Genesis chapter 6. Genesis gives only a few lines to the episode. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of humans, took wives from among them, and that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Then the biblical story moves on, but Enoch refuses to move on. Instead, it expands those few verses into an entire explanation for the corruption of the ancient world. The Watchers teach humanity forbidden knowledge. They reveal techniques associated with warfare, weapons, magic, cosmetics, astrology, and other forms of knowledge that the Enochic author considers dangerous. Their rebellion is therefore not merely sexual. It becomes intellectual and cosmic. The boundary between heaven and earth has been violated, and the consequences spread through human society. Then come the giants. The giants are described as enormous and destructive. They consume the resources of the earth. And eventually, according to the story, they turn against humanity itself. The world becomes violent. The Watchers have corrupted creation. Their offspring have become destructive, and humanity is suffering under the consequences. The divine response is the flood. The bodies of the giants are destroyed. The rebellious Watchers are imprisoned. At first, that sounds like the end of the story. The physical threat is gone. The giants have died. The Watchers have been restrained. But Enoch introduces a remarkable complication. The bodies may have been destroyed, but the spirits associated with those giants remain. This is the point where the ancient explanation for demons begins to take shape. In chapters 15 and 16, God explains to Enoch what happened to the spirits of the giants. The giants were produced from a mixture of human flesh and the heavenly Watchers. Because of that unusual origin, their physical bodies cannot survive indefinitely, but their spirits remain on earth, and these spirits become what the text calls evil spirits. Their role is not passive. They afflict, they oppress, they attack, they destroy, they cause trouble. And then comes the sentence that has fascinated readers for centuries. They take no food, but they nevertheless hunger and thirst. That sentence is the key to understanding the entire idea. Notice what the text does not say. It does not say they eat fear. It does not say they consume the electromagnetic energy of frightened humans. It does not mention cortisol. It does not mention adrenaline. It does not describe a biological or electromagnetic feeding mechanism. Those concepts belong to modern interpretations, not to the ancient text itself. What Enoch does give us is something more fundamental. These spirits possess appetite without ordinary physical consumption. They are hungry, but physical food cannot satisfy them. They exist in a permanent state of deficiency. And that idea may tell us more about the ancient author's understanding of evil than any modern theory about electromagnetic energy ever could. Think about the logic of the story. The giants were creatures of mixed origin. They came from the union of heavenly beings and human women. Their physical bodies belonged to the earthly world, but their ancestry was partly heavenly. When their bodies die, something remains that does not fit neatly into either category. Their spirits cannot return to heaven. They remain on earth. They are neither ordinary humans nor ordinary heavenly beings. They are beings trapped between categories, and their hunger becomes part of that condition. They cannot live as humans do. They cannot ascend as heavenly beings do. They remain on earth, seeking something they cannot fully possess. This is one reason the story became so influential in later traditions about demons. The Enochic explanation offers an origin story for malevolent spirits. Instead of simply assuming demons have always existed, the text connects certain evil spirits to a specific primordial rebellion. Their existence is a consequence of the Watcher's violation. And that makes the story fundamentally different from the popular image of demons as simply fallen angels. In Enoch, the spirits of the giants and the imprisoned Watchers are not exactly the same thing. The Watchers are the heavenly rebels. Their offspring are the giants. The giants die. Their spirits remain. Those spirits become the evil spirits that continue to trouble humanity. This distinction becomes important later because Enoch gives different roles to these beings. In chapter 19, for example, Enoch is shown the place associated with the fallen angels and their spirits. Uriel explains that these spirits take various forms and lead humans astray into sacrificing to demons as gods. Again, the ancient text gives us something very specific. The spirits influence human behavior. They corrupt. They mislead. They encourage destructive religious practices. But it still does not say that they literally consume fear. So where did the idea of fear-feeding come from? It comes from combining several ideas that exist separately in ancient literature and modern science. The first idea is hunger without food. The second is spiritual beings that afflict human beings. The third is the ancient association between fear, suffering, sacrifice, and supernatural danger. The fourth is modern knowledge about what fear does to the human body. When these ideas are combined, it is tempting to imagine fear as a kind of spiritual food. But temptation is not evidence, and that distinction is essential if we want to understand what the Book of Enoch actually says. Fear is unquestionably a real biological state. When humans perceive danger, the nervous system responds rapidly. The sympathetic nervous system becomes active. The body prepares for action. Heart rate can increase. Breathing changes. Muscles become more ready to respond. Hormones and neurotransmitters associated with stress and arousal become involved. Cortisol and adrenaline are part of the body's complex response to threat. A frightened person, therefore, does produce measurable physiological changes, but none of that demonstrates the existence of supernatural entities feeding on those changes. Science can measure the biological consequences of fear. It cannot use those measurements to establish that an invisible spirit is consuming them. That is where the ancient story and modern science must be kept separate. The science can explain fear. The ancient text can explain how one ancient community imagined evil. But science does not confirm the supernatural mechanism. That may sound like it weakens the mystery. In reality, it makes the mystery more interesting. Because the real question is not whether Enoch secretly predicted modern neuroscience. The real question is why an ancient author described evil as something that leaves beings hungry even when they cannot eat. That is a psychological and theological idea with remarkable depth. Imagine an enemy that can never be satisfied. You cannot negotiate with hunger. You cannot convince hunger that it has had enough. If the spirit's condition is defined by permanent deficiency, then its destructive behavior becomes almost inevitable within the story's logic. This is probably what makes the Enochic spirits so unsettling. They are not simply evil because they made one bad decision. Their existence itself has become disordered. Their origin is abnormal. Their bodies are gone. Their spirits remain. And their appetite has no ordinary object. The result is perpetual disturbance. This is also where the competitor narrative goes much further than the evidence. It claims that Enoch describes fear as a specific electromagnetic and biochemical signature that these entities harvest. But no surviving passage in 1st Enoch gives such a mechanism. The text is ancient. Its language is religious and apocalyptic. Its explanations belong to the intellectual world of Second Temple Judaism. The author did not possess modern neuroscience, electromagnetic field theory, or molecular biology. Trying to turn those ancient passages into a technical description of 21st century physiology creates an illusion of scientific confirmation that the text itself does not provide. And there is another major misconception that needs to be corrected. The Book of Enoch was not simply removed from the Bible by one council in the 4th century and then buried for 1700 years. The historical story is more complicated. Portion Enoch circulated among Jewish communities before Christianity. Fragments of several Enochic writings were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. In fact, scholars identify 11 Aramaic manuscripts of Horn Enoch from Qumran Cave 4. That discovery is enormously important because it proves that major portions of the Enochic tradition existed centuries before the Christian era. The Qumran evidence also shows that the text was not some medieval invention. Its roots are genuinely ancient, but the Dead Sea Scrolls did not contain 11 complete copies of the exact Ethiopic book that survives today. They contain fragmentary manuscripts of different Enochic compositions. That distinction matters. The modern one, Enoch, is a collection. Different sections were composed at different times. Some portions are represented among the Qumran manuscripts, other portions are not. The famous parables of Enoch, for example, are not represented among the Qumran Enoch manuscripts currently known. This is one reason scholars continue to debate the composition and transmission of the collection. The story of its survival is therefore not a simple tale of a forbidden book being hidden from humanity. It is a story of textual transmission. Some Enochic traditions disappeared from circulation in parts of the Jewish and Christian world. Others survived. The complete text eventually became preserved in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition continues to treat Horn Enoch as part of its biblical canon. That alone destroys the idea that the text was universally erased. It was never erased everywhere. It survived continuously in Ethiopia. And when European scholars became aware of complete Ethiopic manuscripts in the 18th century, the Western world began to recover a text that had largely disappeared from Western Christian circulation. The Scottish traveler James Bruce brought several Ge'ez manuscripts of Enoch to Europe in 1773. Later, scholars translated and studied them. And the discoveries at Qumran provided something even more valuable. Older witnesses, fragments written in Aramaic, a window into the ancient textual world from which the Enochic traditions emerged. So what happened at the Council of Laodicea? This is another place where popular stories often simplify history. The Council of Laodicea, generally dated to the 4th century, contains canons concerning church practice and the reading of books. Canon 59 says that uncanonical books should not be read in church. A traditionally transmitted Canon 60 provides a list of biblical books. But the authenticity of Canon 60 has itself been questioned by scholars. More importantly, the surviving canon list does not say, "We are removing the Book of Enoch because it reveals how demons feed on human fear." There is no historical evidence for such a statement. There is no documented vote explaining that church leaders wanted to suppress an electromagnetic theory of fear. That is a modern narrative layered onto an ancient text. The actual history of Enoch's decline in Western Christianity is much more complicated. Early Christian writers knew the book, the New Testament letter of Jude, contains a passage closely related to 1 Enoch 1:9. Some early Christian authors valued Enoch highly. Others questioned its authority. Over time, its status became increasingly uncertain in Greek and Latin Christianity. Eventually, it ceased to be part of the biblical canon used by most Western churches, but the reasons were theological, canonical, historical, and textual. They cannot honestly be reduced to a conspiracy to hide the secret food of demons. And this is important because the real history is fascinating enough. We do not need to invent a conspiracy. A text that was written and compiled in the Second Temple period survived in fragments at Qumran, disappeared from much of the Western tradition, survived in Ethiopia, and eventually returned to Western scholarship through Ethiopic manuscripts. That is already an extraordinary story. But there is another reason the fear interpretation remains attractive. It connects with a very old human observation. Fear changes behavior. A frightened person becomes more reactive. Fear can spread from one person to another. Communities can become organized around threats. Rulers can use fear. Religious movements can use fear. Propaganda can use fear. Even modern media systems can exploit fear because frightening information captures attention. None of this requires supernatural beings. Human psychology alone can create powerful cycles of fear. And perhaps this is where the ancient story becomes unexpectedly relevant. The spirits of Enoch are described as beings that afflict humanity and lead people astray. If we read the story symbolically rather than pretending it is a scientific report, the idea of an enemy that thrives when humans are vulnerable becomes remarkably recognizable. Fear can cause people to make decisions they would not make while calm. Fear can narrow attention. Fear can make threats seem larger. Fear can make uncertainty unbearable. Fear can make people search desperately for protection. And fear can make people surrender judgment to anyone who claims to possess the answer. That is a very real form of predation. It does not require an invisible creature. It requires only another human being who understands how fear works. But the Enochic story goes even deeper. The spirits do not simply frighten people. They distort worship. They lead people toward destructive behavior. They operate through deception and disorder. In that sense, the ancient author is less interested in fear as a substance than in fear as a pathway. Fear changes what humans do, and what humans do can change the world around them. This is why the Enochic story should not be reduced to the claim that demons literally eat terror. The text is presenting a cosmology of evil. It is trying to explain how corruption entered the world, why evil spirits exist, why humanity suffers, and why the consequences of the Watcher's rebellion continue after the flood. The answer is dramatic. The spirits of the giants remain on Earth. They cannot eat ordinary food. They remain hungry. They continue to afflict humanity, and they will continue until the final judgment. That last point explains the "why can't it stop" part of the title. The ancient text gives the spirits a temporary but persistent existence. Their activity continues until the great judgment. They are not presented as creatures that humans can simply destroy. Their final end belongs to God's judgment. This is not because they are feeding on an inexhaustible electromagnetic energy supply. It is because the Enochic story places their destruction in an eschatological future. The persistence is theological. It is part of the author's explanation of why evil continues in the present world even after the catastrophic judgment of the flood. And that creates a fascinating paradox. The flood destroys the giants, but it does not immediately eliminate the consequences of their existence. The physical problem is solved. The spiritual problem remains. The story, therefore, transforms the giants from physical monsters into an enduring spiritual threat. Their bodies are gone. Their influence is not. That idea helps explain why the story became so influential in later Jewish and Christian thinking about demons. It also explains why the Enochic tradition matters far beyond the strange details of the Watchers. It represents an early attempt to answer one of humanity's oldest questions. If God is just, why does evil continue? The Enochic answer is not simple. Evil has a history. It has causes. It spreads through boundaries that should never have been crossed. It creates consequences that outlive the original perpetrators, and the world remains trapped in the aftermath until a final act of judgment restores the proper order. That is a very different story from the claim that ancient people somehow discovered electromagnetic fear. And it is arguably more powerful, because it speaks directly to something human beings have experienced in every age, the feeling that danger does not end when the original danger disappears. A traumatic event can be over, yet its effects remain. A war can end, yet generations may live with its consequences. A betrayal can happen once, yet suspicion can continue for years. A civilization can collapse, yet its fears can survive in its myths. Ancient stories often preserve these patterns in supernatural language. The spirits of the giants are one example. The fear-feeding interpretation takes that ancient image and turns it into a literal supernatural mechanism. But the original text is more restrained. And there is one more fascinating detail. The Book of Enoch is not simply a text about monsters. It is a text about knowledge. The Watchers reveal knowledge to humanity. Enoch receives knowledge from angels. He is shown hidden places. He learns about heavenly movements. He's given explanations for things ordinary humans cannot see. The central conflict, therefore, concerns boundaries of knowledge. What should humans know? What should remain hidden? What happens when beings cross boundaries that were meant to separate heaven and earth? These questions are everywhere in ancient apocalyptic literature. And that is one reason Enoch remains so compelling today. It is not simply frightening, it is intellectually ambitious. It tries to map the invisible world. It tries to explain suffering. It tries to explain evil. It tries to explain the relationship between heaven, earth, humanity, angels, spirits, and the final judgment. And it does all of this through the voice of a man who, according to Genesis, was taken by God without an ordinary death. That tiny biblical mystery became the foundation for an enormous literary universe. So when someone says that the Book of Enoch proves that demons literally feed on human fear, the best response is not simply yes or no. The better question is, what does Enoch actually say? It says the spirits of the giants are evil spirits. It says they remain on earth. It says they afflict and attack human beings. It says they take no food but nevertheless hunger and thirst. It says they continue their destructive activity until the great judgment. It says related spirits can lead humans into sacrificing to demons. Those are textual claims. The electromagnetic theory is not. The cortisol theory is not. The idea that ancient authors understood fear as a measurable biochemical broadcast is not. Those are modern interpretations. and separating them makes the ancient text more, not less, interesting. Because once the unsupported science is removed, we are left with an ancient psychological and theological insight. An enemy does not necessarily need to consume your body to harm you. It can influence what you think. It can influence what you fear. It can influence what you worship. It can influence what you do. And if fear causes you to surrender your judgment, then fear has already changed your behavior before anything supernatural enters the picture. That may be the most useful way to understand the story today, not as proof that invisible creatures are secretly harvesting electromagnetic energy from frightened people, but as a warning about what happens when fear becomes the force controlling human decisions. The ancient author imagined that process through spirits. Modern psychology can describe parts of it through stress, attention, conditioning, and behavior. The vocabulary has changed. The human experience has not. And there's one final irony in the story. The spirits of the giants are hungry because they are trapped in a condition that cannot be satisfied by ordinary food. Their hunger is permanent. Their activity is temporary. Eventually, according to Enoch, judgment ends their existence. So the answer to why they cannot stop is not that fear is an infinite energy source. It is that the author has created beings whose very nature is disordered and whose destructive existence continues until a final cosmic judgment. That is the actual horror. They are not portrayed as ordinary creatures making ordinary choices. They are the lasting consequence of an ancient violation of the boundary between heaven and earth. And perhaps that is why this strange passage has survived for so long. The Book of Enoch asks us to look at evil differently, not simply as something that appears, but as something that can be inherited, something that can spread, something that can survive the destruction of its original form, and something that can continue influencing humanity long after the event that created it has passed into memory. The ancient world did not have modern neuroscience. It did not have electromagnetic field detectors. It did not know about cortisol in the modern scientific sense. But it understood something that remains painfully familiar. Fear changes people. Fear can control people. Fear can make people act against their own interests. Fear can become self-reinforcing. And when fear becomes the center of a person's world, the person can begin feeding the very system that keeps the fear alive. That final idea does not require demons. It requires only an understanding of human nature. And perhaps that is why the Book of Enoch continues to fascinate people more than 2,000 years after its earliest sections were written. The text does not give us a scientific explanation for fear. It gives us a mythic explanation for the persistence of evil. It tells us that after the giants died, something remained. The bodies disappeared. The spirits remained. They could not eat ordinary food. They could not escape the earth. They continued to afflict humanity, and they waited for the final judgment. Whether someone reads that literally, symbolically, historically, or theologically is a matter of interpretation. But the ancient words themselves deserve to be heard before modern theories are placed on top of them. Because the real mystery of Enoch is not that it secretly predicted modern science. The real mystery is that an ancient community looked at a violent and frightening world and tried to explain why evil seemed to survive, even after its apparent defeat. Their answer was the story of the Watchers, the giants, and the spirits that remained. And those spirits were hungry. Not because Enoch tells us they were consuming electromagnetic fear, but because the author imagined evil itself as something permanently deprived, permanently restless, and unable to find satisfaction. That is a powerful image. An appetite without an object, a hunger without food, a destructive force that continues until the end. And perhaps the most important lesson is not to ask whether some invisible entity is feeding on your fear. It is to ask what fear is feeding inside you, because that part is real. Fear can feed anger. Fear can feed suspicion. Fear can feed hatred. Fear can feed manipulation. Fear can feed the endless cycle of attention that keeps frightening information alive. And unlike the supernatural spirits of Enoch, those systems are not hidden in another dimension. They exist in human behavior, institutions, relationships, and minds. The ancient Book of Enoch survives because people kept asking questions about the invisible forces shaping their world. Today, we ask many of the same questions using different language. What creates evil? Why does suffering persist? Why do destructive patterns repeat? Why does fear have so much power over us? And can that cycle ever be broken? Enoch's answer was ultimately eschatological. The spirits would continue until the great judgment. Their hunger would not last forever. Their existence had an endpoint. That is important because the story is not actually one of endless evil. It is a story in which evil appears powerful precisely because its final defeat has not yet arrived. The spirits may continue. They may afflict, they may deceive, but they are not ultimately in control. And that is where the ancient story reaches its conclusion. The Book of Enoch does not prove that demons consume human fear. It gives us something more historically defensible and, in its own way, more disturbing. It gives us an ancient explanation for why evil spirits exist. why they remain hungry despite taking no food, why they continue to trouble humanity, and why their activity is expected to continue until a final judgment. The fear-feeding idea is an interpretation. The hungry spirits are in the text. The watchers are in the text. The giants are in the text. The flood is in the text. The spirits that remain afterward are in the text, and the ancient author's unanswered question remains with us. What happens when something is created that can never be satisfied? For Enoch, the answer was terrifying. It keeps searching, it keeps afflicting, it keeps disturbing humanity. And it continues until the end. More than 2,000 years later, the story still survives because the question has never really disappeared. What feeds the things that destroy us? And perhaps, even more importantly, what happens when we keep giving them exactly what they need? If you found this investigation into the Book of Enoch fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into ancient texts, forgotten traditions, and the historical evidence behind the stories that have survived for thousands of years. And if you want to explore another ancient mystery where the evidence is even stranger than the legend, stay with us, because the next discovery may completely change the way you understand the world these ancient writers believed existed beyond what human eyes could see.